Thank you very much for that introduction. I don't know whether I agree with everything that was just said about me, but listen, I'm just the warm-up act for Jeffrey Robertson this afternoon. So you know, I can't fail to disappoint. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this beautiful country and to pay tribute to their spirit of resistance and collective dreaming that another kind of world is possible, one that puts people first. Because I have the soapbox up the front, and this is, as I'm sure John would agree, an incredible imbalance of power relations, because I can say whatever I like up the front here, you'll have to indulge me because I want to tell a little personal story to begin with. I believe it has relevance to the subject matter that is being discussed throughout this program, which I think is just fantastic that this program exists. I'll be telling a few stories if I get the chance, because I think nothing speaks the truth like simply telling it as it is, telling the stories. And one of the great gaps in Australian political life is that the stories from below are not being told. Those who say that it's a matter of truth being spoken to power, that's right. But I don't believe that the truth needs to be spoken to power up there. Truth needs to be spoken to power here. We need to tell the truth to each other, because that builds solidarity and that strengthens our arm for the struggle that is to come. And the struggles are many. Anyway, I'll tell my little story. As a very keen disciple of the teachings of, you thought I was going to say Jesus there, but no, of Mark Latham, I always read to my children at night. You might remember it was one of the things he got right policy-wise, that he spoke very passionately about the need for reading with children. Anyway, a few years ago, my son, who was then aged probably around 7, and I were on his bed reading. He always liked me to either read to him or he would read to me, or sometimes we would just read silently to ourselves, but the point was we were reading together. And this one night we were lying there together and we were both reading our own books silently. And he turned to me after reading for 5 minutes or so and he said, "You know, Papa, I can't get to sleep at night unless I read first." And I said, "Same with me, son." He said, "That's because when I become an adult, I want to be like you." And I thought, got one of those really warm glows. Then he said, "Well, not bald." Or fat. Now, the reason I tell you this story is my son Gian was not trying to have a go at me. He wasn't even trying to be funny. He was simply telling the truth as it is. He was stating the obvious, just in case I didn't quite get it, because he doesn't have a lot of confidence in my intellectual capacity. Just in case for a moment I thought he wanted to emulate my physiognomy rather than my love of reading, he thought he'd better just set the record straight. And in a sense, what I wish to share with you this afternoon, and what I encourage you to always try and share with each other, is the bleeding obvious. Because that's what's staring us in the face, that's what's not being addressed in our various concerns and passions for a different kind of society, the bleeding obvious. Now, how do we go about stating the bleeding obvious? Well, often, I would have to say, it entails breaking the rules. I'm not encouraging breaking the laws. I'm being filmed, and so I cannot encourage you to break the laws. I am encouraging you to break rules. A few years back here, I've already launching into another story. My uncle, who was my namesake, who Stephen said I was going to talk about Catholic Church stuff, well, I'm not really going to, because I don't think it's part of the main game in this discussion, although I'm very happy to answer any questions. But this is a little Catholic story. My uncle was only excommunicated by the Catholic Church once. That was in Malta, and it was for political reasons, I have to say, at the time. He was excommunicated, kicked out of the Catholic Church because he voted Labor. And at the time, you were denied absolution and denied the right to go to church if you were a Labor voter. Well, he wasn't just a Labor voter, he had it right out on his sleeve, or literally on his lapel. He was very, very militant. And so he thought, well, stuff it, I know what my principles are. He wasn't a disbeliever, he just thought, well, if they're going to treat me like that, I'm not going to give up my principles. So he was excommunicated. The story goes that his daughter became a nun, so he had to sort of reconcile sooner or later, but he still wouldn't give up his principles. Anyhow, when he came to Australia, he was able to go to church, and it obviously meant a lot to him emotionally, and so he did. This story happened in the south Blacktown, where there's a strong Maltese community. My Uncle John went to a Catholic church service, and there was a Maltese priest running it. Now, I'm allowed to do a Maltese accent, and it's politically correct for me to make fun of my own people. If anyone else tries to do it who is not Maltese, I'll be deeply offended, because you have no right whatsoever to take it out of us. So the priest got up, and he was a very well-known priest in the community, and he got up and gave a absolutely brilliant sermon. He says, my dear people is, I'm going to do the SBS subtitles here for you, people is people in Maltese English. I am going to talk to you about today the problem with the youth. Youth in Maltese English is not a car with the back missing, it means young people. So I'm going to tell you what is the problem with the youth today. The problem with the youth today, you may ask me what is the problem with you. I would tell you, Maltese like to answer our own questions, because that way we're sure we get it right, you see. So I will tell you what is the problem. And we like to sing-song a bit, because we fancy ourselves as singers and poets, but we're pretty crap at both, but we have a go. I will tell you what is the problem with the youth today. The problem with the youth today is, and wait for this piercing social analysis, they do not follow the 10 Commandments. That is the problem with the youth today. And I should know these things because I am the wisest, because the oldest person in this church, because as of last week, I am 70 years old. From the back of the church, my Uncle John, 74! Now, why do I tell this story? Because my Uncle John broke the rules. Because he wasn't going to be silent about a truth that was terribly important. Well, it was to him. How dare someone else take up that position of the oldest and wisest person in that church? So he wasn't going to let that go. Now, he broke all the social contracts that are agreed upon in that kind of setting, where that's a highly ritualised setting. Priest does the talking, people do the listening, and certainly don't do the questioning. But he broke the rules, much to my joy, because he's given me a story to tell over and over again. And that really is at the heart of political activism. In my role in the St Vincent de Paul Society, you might say, well, isn't Vinnie's all about making sure that the soup is ladled out and the blankets are distributed and the refuges are providing beds for the night for those who are left out and pushed out? Well, our members do that, and I have the greatest admiration and respect, because these are very ordinary people, the members of the St Vincent de Paul Society, day after day, night after night, doing this for no other reason than because they've got this really strong sense of solidarity, that these are my sisters and brothers. Charity is a vexed area, because the charitable model that was developed particularly in the Victorian era, but particularly, I have to say, the Christian churches have been very guilty of promoting a charitable model which, number one, makes judgments about who is deserving and who is undeserving. Wrong. That's completely offensive by any standards. And number two, maintains the fiction that by assuaging the consciences of those who perpetrate the injustices, one can keep society afloat and not rock the boat. By making sure that those who fall through the cracks are picked up, we can sort of say, well, things aren't too bad. Well, let me put this to you, my friends. If some people walk past a person who's experiencing homelessness and say to themselves, this is proof that the system is not working. Others, in my opinion, more astute, walk past the person who's experiencing homelessness and say to themselves, this is proof that the system is working. It's working because inequality is at its heart. It's not incidental, it's not accidental. It's at the heart of the system that we are living within. And so when governments and social commentators and charities and journalists and political leaders turn around and blame people who are pushed out and doing it tough for their own marginalisation, this makes me feel completely angered and impassioned because it's not the truth. And the truth has to be spoken in the face of this giant lie. Let me share with you a little story. This is not one of mine. This is from a beautiful book by Edoardo Galeano. Edoardo Galeano wrote this book called The Book of Embraces. He's recently become in demand all of a sudden because the Venezuelan leader Hugo Chavez, who some of you might know of, gave a book by Edoardo Galeano called The Open Veins of Latin America to Obama. And so everyone wanted to rush out and buy this book because Obama's got a copy, so it must be interesting. But I can assure you, Edoardo Galeano writes interesting stuff with or without the present. This is a little story set in Nicaragua. Fernando Silva ran the children's hospital in Managua. On Christmas Eve, he worked late into the night. Firecrackers were exploding and fireworks lit up the sky when Fernando decided it was time to leave. They were expecting him at home to celebrate the holiday. He took one last look around, checking to see that everything was in order, when he heard cottony footsteps behind him. He turned to find one of the sick children walking after him. In the half light, he recognised a lonely, doomed child. Fernando recognised his face lined with death and those eyes asking for forgiveness or perhaps permission. Fernando walked over to the little boy and the boy gave him his hand. "Tell someone," the boy whispered. "Tell someone I'm here." The people who are pushed out, even in a country as prosperous as Australia, those who are marginalised, excluded, are very much like that little boy. The party's going on full steam and they're outside wondering why they're not allowed to be in. They feel forgotten and they feel to blame for being locked out of the party. We're often under the impression that we have to go far to find the people who are left out or pushed out, to find the broken. We engage in this language of blame, which is a language of refusal, a pretense that the broken must be alien, clearly from somewhere else. You see it in the language we use to demonise asylum seekers. You see it in the language we use to demonise and blame the first peoples of this country who are still suffering the effects of systematic colonisation and dispossession. You see it in the language that is used to blame people for being unemployed, to blame people for being sole parents doing it tough. You see it in all of those forms of language, but the broken are not alien to us. The broken are right here where it hurts. That's where the broken are. And to me, this is a source of great power because no one can tell the story of brokenness like those who are broken. And it's a matter of creating the space so that those stories can be told. I don't say this as a means of convincing the powerful to acknowledge the daily struggle of those who are crushed. Rather, I say it for two reasons. First, because as pointed out by that notorious 19th century German social analyst Karl Marx, in his 11th thesis of Feuerbach, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. This may sound like the bleeding obvious. Well, it is. And that's why I'm saying it again here. As you know, from the perspective of those who've been left out in the lucky country, it's understood to be the bleeding obvious that has been monumentally ignored. When some years ago, when I first started working for Vinnie's as the National Research and Advocacy Officer, I was ceremoniously outed in that highly esteemed academic journal, Sydney's Daily Telegraph, as I was outed as evidence of the communist control of the St Vincent de Paul Society. A paper I had given at a conference at the University of Newcastle on unemployment was quoted. I must admit that the quotes were quite taken out of context, but the opening lines of the article by Michael Duffy was, "It seems like Comrade Falzon from the St Vincent de Paul Society hasn't been reading his Bible enough, but has been reading Das Kapital." Well, I thought, there goes that job. That was fun. I was only there for a couple of months, and I couldn't help opening my big mouth and getting myself the sack, I thought. So I rang the national president. It's a volunteer organisation, and our national council is all held by volunteers, the positions. And he was in Perth, and I rang him. It was a Saturday morning. I was visiting my mum and dad with my wife and children in Blacktown, and said, "Look, this article's been written, and what would you like?" For pretty well offering my resignation. He said, "Have you done anything?" He was Scottish. I can't do a really good Scottish accent, but I can't resist it. I know it's politically incorrect after what I said about Maltese, but what the hell? I've got the pulpit, you know. He says, "Have you done anything wrong?" I said, no, I don't resile from anything I've said. I'm proud of what I've said, and I'd say it again. And he said, "Right, draft me a letter to the editor responding, and I'll sign it." So I had the opportunity to quote those beautiful lines from the Brazilian Archbishop Helder Camará, a man who came from a very wealthy background, who was very really fascist in his views of the world, but he was educated by the oppressed in the northeastern corner of Brazil, the best education you can receive. And so he was mightily persecuted for this, for taking a stand on the side of the poor. He was shot at, his colleagues were kidnapped, all sorts of things. And he said the famous words, which I put in that letter to the editor and got published. He said, "When I give bread to the poor, people call me a saint. But when I ask why they have no bread, people call me a communist." It was perfect. It was great. And so from then on, Vinnie's, instead of being resiling and recoiling from this tough stance, I had a sense that there was a really strong groundswell of support and of bolshiness, of saying, we're not going to back down. We'll criticise the government if we have to. And it's gone on. Hence, I still have my job, touch wood. At the federal budget this year, I certainly took a strong stance criticising the government because whilst they responded to the legitimate call for an increase, albeit inadequate, in the aged pension, they completely left out two of the groups that are doing it really tough and who make up about 60% of the people we're assisting, sole parents and people experiencing unemployment. Left them out totally. And I thought, this is outrageous. And so the media conference of the night of the budget, I made the statement that this was the budget. You have to use a bit of a hook to get the media interested. That's a little trick that I'm sure others more qualified than I can talk to you about. But my little hook to get the media interested was, this is the budget of the biggest loser. Those who were left out before have emerged as the forgotten people again. Well, the media picked it up, and the next day at the Press Club lunch, Paul Bongiorno from Network 10 got up and asked Wayne Swan, first cab off the rank, this question. Treasurer, hasn't the St Vincent de Paul Society got a point when it says this is the budget of the biggest loser? No reference to any program on Network 10, because you've just projected the increase in unemployment rates in Australia, and yet you've done nothing to support the people who are the most vulnerable. Well, the Treasurer got really upset by this and really took it personally, which really upset me a lot, sort of. The point was this, though. I haven't achieved what I wanted to in making sure that those groups do get an income increase, and as a matter of fact, recent announcements from Minister Macklin have indicated that the government is going even harder against people on income support, with compulsory income management being rolled out. And let me say, now that I'm on my soapbox, because I get worked up about this, this is a cynical manoeuvre to get around the Racial Discrimination Act. It is, because the United Nations insisted that the Northern Territory intervention in suspending the Racial Discrimination Act was in contravention of UN conventions. So instead of addressing the elements that were wrong, the government has decided to get into getting around it by imposing quarantining of welfare payments eventually on everyone. And my position is they're not doing away with racial discrimination, they're just adding class discrimination to it. Exactly. I'm glad someone agrees anyway. Now, the point is this though, the truth needs to be spoken even when there are not popular responses, even when you don't get someone saying, I agree, even when you feel like you're the lone voice. And I'm sure John over here knows more about that than most of us in being the lone voice trying to tell the truth. And it's not an ego trip, because it's nothing about you. It's about, the way I look at it is this, the people we assist in Vinnie's, some people think, oh, we're giving to them. They are giving us something incredibly precious and sacred. They're giving us their stories. What could be more sacred than that? That's why, as part of my acknowledgement of country, I wanted to pay respects to the stories, the sacred stories, because in them contain the seeds of hope and resistance. Now, I just quoted Karl Marx, but I don't want to forget the other great 20th century social analyst, Groucho Marx, who had something quite prophetic to say to political leaders everywhere, precisely on this point of skating round the core issues. Groucho once said, "These are my principles, but if you don't like them, I have others." I believe that unless we really address... Have I come undone here? Because I get a bit excited. It's a WOG thing, I'm sorry. We can't help it. So. I never done nothing, officer. Thank you. There, we popped off again then. That's it. See, I'm there. Is that right?
That's a different one, yep, that'll be sweet.
All right, good. I want to share with you another little principle, since Groucho Marx has said about these are my principles. Professor John McKnight came up with a very neat formulation. It goes like this: revolutions begin when people who are defined as problems achieve the power to redefine the problem. I'll say it again because I think it's a perler. Revolutions begin when people who are defined as problems achieve the power to redefine the problem. And that's what I mean about telling the stories, about taking the stage to say, let's really explain what's happening on the ground. The German poet Bertolt Brecht once put it so beautifully. He wrote, "The compassion of the oppressed for the oppressed is indispensable. It is the world's one hope." The compassion of the oppressed for the oppressed is indispensable. It is the world's one hope. And that's what I meant when I said the truth needs to be spoken to power, i.e. to each other. That's the compassion of the oppressed and those who stand in solidarity with them. I had an experience a few years ago in a media interview where it was on welfare reform, but it was under the Howard government's first or second round of welfare reforms. And I was in trouble again for saying some things that actually many of the other NGOs were not willing to say. And again, it wasn't a reflection on me, it was a reflection on the fact that these were the stories we were hearing from below and they needed to be told in the political sphere. I did a few interviews, including some shock jocks, which was always fun, but the interview that most stays with me is one with an ABC regional radio station, I think from Queensland, if my memory serves me correctly. And I thought incorrectly that it might be a slightly more sympathetic interviewer. Well, I was totally wrong, so she just got stuck into me big time, this interviewer. And it was very, very robust interview. I love it. I love a good stoush. So she's saying, "So John, you want people to sit on their backsides and do nothing and get money for nothing, do you? Is that what the St Vincent de Paul Society stands for?" And she really gave it to me. And I thought, gee, I know I expect this from the shock jocks, but yeah, this is coming from our ABC, you know? And I thought, good on you, this is good. Anyway, end of interview. She said, "John, are you still on the line?" I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "John, we're off air now. I just want to say to you, you know, the ABC has to remain completely impartial." I said, "Yes, I know that. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it." And she said, "But John, I'm a single mother myself and I reckon this legislation sucks big time. It's criminal and go Vinnies, good on ya!" So, as an adjunct to that beautiful quote from John McKnight about where revolutions begin, there's a flip side though. There's a flip side, and this is scrawled on the walls of the countries where structural oppression is at its most obvious and in your face and often violent. And the graffiti that's scrawled on the walls goes along the lines of where the conditions for revolution do not exist. It is the job of the revolutionary to create them. And that's where activists come in. Not to falsely impose something that's alien to what's happening on the ground, not to pretend, but to create the conditions in which people can be aware of the need for change. Not a matter of personal change, although that comes into it, but really changing the conditions that cause the oppression in a given society. The founder of Vinnies was a young activist, academic in the 19th century in Paris named Frederick Ozanam, and he said something beautiful. He quoted the parable of the Good Samaritan, and he said, charity is the Samaritan who pours oil on the wounds of the traveller who has been attacked, but it is justice's role to prevent the attack. And that's what I think is absolutely crucial as a counterpoint to that false notion that charity, whether it's hot, warm or cold, can actually be a substitute for justice. I'll leave you with a couple of quick thoughts before handing over to John here. One thought is this. There's an indigenous Brazilian proverb, and this to me is absolutely central to any meaningful approach to social change. The proverb goes like this: when we dream alone, it is only a dream, but when we dream together, it is the beginning of reality. When we dream alone, it is only a dream, but when we dream together, it is the beginning of reality. And POL340, also from Brazil, a great educational theorist, said the oppressor cannot find in their power the strength to liberate either the oppressed or themselves. Only the power that springs from the weakness of the oppressed will be sufficiently strong to free both. And that's what, again, I keep saying, truth being spoken to power is happening right here. I remember being very humbled by an experience some years ago in a pub that had been converted to a community centre in Sydney, where a group of recovering drug addicts who were also parents were meeting together to put together a book of their stories, a beautiful, empowering project. I wasn't the project leader, I was just a ring-in, come to see what was going on, and I felt very inspired by what they were doing. And I remember one woman talking to me about her time in jail, and she was an Aboriginal lady and said that it was frequent that she'd be picked up for no real reason necessarily, and she'd spend a night or two in the cells. And I said, oh, yeah, what was it like? Did you at least try and sleep? And she just looked at me and she said, the cells are a sad place, brother. The cells are a sad place, brother. You don't get to sleep in the cells. And it hit me like a bolt of lightning. Something that's easy to miss in that little word of incredible sacredness and wisdom that she shared with me. Number one, that she has experienced the sadness of the world in that experience of being incarcerated regularly. But the thing that really cut me up in a way was through no merit of my own, she called me her brother. And I thought, that's unreal. By calling me her brother, by accepting me as her brother, it was like she was taking me into the cells with her to see their sadness, to see the sadness in the heart of the world, to see the sadness that she has carried, which also contains the seeds of hope, of change. I belong to that world with her, that world of the jail cells, a world that cries out to be changed. But as Lilla Watson, the great Aboriginal activist, and a group of her comrades from the 1970s in Brisbane reminded us, and I'll leave you with these words: if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I felt like leaving. It's a pretty hard act to follow, that one, isn't it? It's very, very moving and poignant presentation. I had never met John before today. Tony Vinson and I have done a lot of work together, and he'll be speaking in January. He was a fellow who tried to reform the prison system and has done some excellent work in education and other fields. And he suggested that I contact this fellow called John Falzon. And I'm so pleased I did, and I'm so pleased you came. Yeah, there's a lot that I've got to learn from your experience. When I first met the committee, and this was over a year ago, with the idea of the Community Empowerment course, there was a group made up of the Faculty of Law, the Faculty of Arts with Political Science and Social Science, and the Faculty of Commerce representatives. And I presented them a paper, and the point of that paper was, if it's not in your face, and it's not a how-to and you can and we must, then I'm better off going fishing. And fortunately, we have people of vision in this university who saw that after reading that paper, that there's a lot that this university could do. Now, I've asked Glenn to put the paper in IT form so that everybody can get access to it, on all the campuses and in Wollongong, because just the headings alone, I think, will make you think about a lot of things that you hadn't thought of before, and you will make me think of a lot of things that I hadn't thought of before, and from that will come quite a good interchange. The other thing that I've given Glenn, as I mentioned last time, a number of papers to circulate, and they will appear eventually, and you can get access to those. In addition to what I was going to say today, we've shortened the program for Jeffrey Robinson to come, and so I won't be able to cover everything there, but that once again the headings on what I have to say today will be available to you. It was mentioned about Karl Marx. I have a joke about Stephen Mark, who is the Legal Services Commissioner in New South Wales. And anybody that knows anything about the way the law works in Australia can make their own mind up about how effective the Legal Service Commissioner is. And I say to people, when they ask me about the Legal Services Commission, I say, well, Stephen Mark reminds me of Karl Marx. They're both dead. And that's precisely the situation in that part of the world. What I wanted to cover was where we've come from and hopefully where we're going, because so far and up until about mid-January, we're going to be, as you'll see from the paper that you'll get, you'll see that we'll be verbalising the problems and emphasising what members of Parliament don't do, what bureaucrats don't do, what government doesn't do, and what communities can do, and that's the second part of the course, what communities can do and must do and how to. And that's the part that I'm really excited to get to. But I want to look at the political landscape, which was the topic that was set down today, and I was interested in John's perspective because he comes in from a perspective of a person in charge of an organisation that's out there on the ground trying to help the poor, running into the bureaucratic nightmares and the political misunderstanding and the spin and all the things and how it affects the people that his whole network is trying to help get up off the ground. I can really relate to that. I came from Hammondville. To get into Hammondville, your parents had to be unemployed, homeless, have 3 children under 5, and be destitute. And so everybody in the village of Hammondville, where I grew up, I was born in 1933. I arrived in Hammondville at 2 years of age in 1935. As I mentioned in the first talk I gave here, my mother was not expected to live through my birth through malnutrition. So I come from a background where everybody in that village came from social disadvantage. And there's a special bond amongst all of those people when we get together. But there's a special steel in your spine when the abuse is being piled on you, when the mountains seem impossible to climb. You can think back and you can say, we can do it. And I want you to feel that. I want to tell you another story. In Ruth's book called A Stench in This Parliament, which was written on my political career and rose out of her MA thesis. Sorry, I'll just... the purpose of that book was a how-to, you can, and we must. But the point, really, of that book is to try and make people feel empowered. Now, when that book was launched by the Speaker of the Parliament, the first independent Speaker we've had in many, many decades, and he's very interesting to talk to because he observes what's happening from a different point of view. And when I wrote him a cheeky letter and said, will you launch this book, it's called A Stench in This Parliament, as the Speaker of the Parliament, He rang me up and he said, "I'd be delighted to, John." He said, "I privately share your view." And he said, "You know, I'm in politics because I heard you speak at a meeting one night at Inverell." And that's the message, very clear, that I get from the students in all of these campuses. All of you people out there, you can make a contribution, you must make a contribution, and hopefully this course will show you how to make that contribution. So I want to run very quickly through some potted history because it's important to know where we came from. A governed colony, English law and the Westminster system, which has been totally bastardised. MPs were appointed. The landed gentry had control. The MPs were then elected on a very strict eligibility clause, and it was men only. And there was a federation in the turn of the century with a famous meeting at Corowa on the Murray. And Australia led the world. And that's a feeling I get here, that we could lead the world in climate change. We can lead the world in community empowerment. As we did then, we led the world in women, the right for women to vote, proportional representation, preferential voting. We invented it in Australia. The first Workers' Party, the true Workers' Party, formed under a gum tree in Barcaldine. The ALP, similarly bastardised. And I look at these magnificent milestones, and that gives me strength and heart, because we can do it, we did do it, and we can do it again. Barnard and Eldershaw, in the book called Lost Horizons, made the famous statement about wars. Australians fought in strange places for strange causes. And if you look at that history in Boer War, World War I, what the hell were we doing there in either of those cases? World War II, the only one where our own nation was threatened. And then the really recent examples of political wars, like the forgotten war in Malaya and Korea, and the forgotten service personnel in Vietnam and Iran and Iraq. And my God, the politicians have got a lot to answer for. But they never are tried. They never are tried. Not even in the court of public opinion. I think, and I may be rose glasses, but because there's plenty of exceptions, but I rate the 1900s, turn of the century, to the 1970s, the era of the true believers. These were people who actually believed in things. I don't believe that the believers believe in anything anymore. We've got Jack Lang. I mean, my father would worship Jack Lang because in the Moratorium Acts, he prevented people from having all of their belongings seized by the landlord. And he wanted to repudiate the debt owed to Mother England. And Curtin and Chifley and Menzies. And if you look back on Menzies, his social conscience measured against the day was far greater than it is now, because there was an obligation, a part of the being, even if you were toffee nose, that you did have an obligation to the society and to the underprivileged in the society. And Gorton and Whitlam and Fraser, I've left out Holt, but each one of those people, look at them in a certain light. I've left out Hawke. Why is this so? Because if you want to see what a politician is, what did they do before they were elected, and what did they do after they left Parliament? And give Fraser his due. He has been heavily involved. Where did Hawkey end up? Banker's boy. Now, the turn of the century, we've got the Federation, the Great Depression, and that's what drives a lot of people of my age in this room, the experience of their parents at that time. The people I learnt from in that book, as that book, The Stench in this Parliament shows, the people that taught me most as a young teacher at a high school were the people who returned from the Second World War, who'd been there and seen the hell, and they'd lived it. And then they'd done the service personnel's education course and became teachers. And they were valued people to me and to the student body because they experienced the real world. And I learnt a lot from the people in the staff room who served in New Guinea or as bomber pilots in Great Britain. But after World War II, with it came the prosperity. In the 1960s, the Aborigines were given the vote, and in the 1970s, Whitlam removed the House of Lords as the final arbiter of the courts. Then we moved into the era of the lost ideals, where we are now. And I've just listed the headings because everybody in this room is going to have a different take on those. What were the factors of the lost ideals? Communication. I'll come to each of these individually in a moment. Prosperity, individual greed and corporate power, the loss of memory, because they don't know what hell their forefathers went through in order to give them the Australia that they live in now. Multiculturalism, political party power structure, the election fixing, and all of that ended up in cynicism. It's, to me, an interesting conundrum where we live in a world of magnificent personal as well as global and corporate communication, that we are in the most isolated, socially isolated period in our history. We have all this communication, and yet within our cities, within our country, there are more isolated people and less real communication person to person than there ever was before. It's the cynical use of communication with spin and the ministerial and the local MP's budget, the exploitation of fear about illegal immigration and the covert racism that goes with it, and the shock jocks who are able to influence so many unthinking people, the bread and circuses, the video games, the movies, the constant entertainment. Well, that was a bit of history they did learn from ancient Rome. The concentration of power that the media brings. Another important factor to me was the exposure of lifestyles, because coming from where I came from, and many of you people in my generation, we didn't really know how the other half lived. Now on television, everybody knows how the other half lives. And so you get the perks and the fiddles and the taxation avoidance and the bending of the law. Others, why not me? Why should they enjoy all this? Why should they enjoy all the long lunches? Why should they be on $10 million or $7 million a year? And of course, link that with the communication that gives life to the gimme, we must have consumerism. And so prosperity is a two-edged sword. I call it the receding horizon. The more you have, the more you want, and the horizon keeps getting further and further away. The individual greed, meaning loss of power, because you then, as I mentioned earlier, you're in the southern cotton field situation. You're the slave to the credit card, you're the slave to the mortgage, you're the slave to the bank. Both of you have to work, you have to neglect the family, you haven't got time for your community, you haven't got time to exchange the stories that John was talking about, because you've hooked yourself up to a treadmill that you cannot get off. The decline of culture in the workplace and the decline of unions. And on the other side of it, the collectivisation, the decline of collectivisation from the small business point of view. Building societies have survived. Cooperatives have not. I mentioned the loss of memory of the political past, the loss of relevance of the economic depressions of war, of the slavery of debt, the community values, collectivisation and importance of process. And I keep coming back to process. But one of the other factors, I think, in loss of power is mobility. We live in a mobile society. It's got wonderful advantages if we open our minds and our ears to other cultures and what we can learn from other cultures. It's a magnificent thing. But from the point of view of sorry, I'm a bit tired today, I'm losing it. But from the point of view of community, then you can misbehave. You can shut off your parents. And a lot of parents are hoping they're going to do that, by the way. You can shut off your parents. You can escape the local community. You can escape the consequences of your actions in the immediate short term at any rate. And of course it's led to enormous complexity. So where do we get to where we are now? And I think the great thing that we can do is that we can use the IT revolution to our advantage. For the first time, we can put principles on the internet. I'd like to see a community empowerment foundation across Australia, where ordinary Australians sign up to membership, where through that membership you can fund secretariats, where through that secretariat you can have at least some standing to communicate through the media, newspapers, radio, television, talkback, shock jocks and whatever, to get a point of view continuously across to try and rebuff the oncoming wave of disinformation and bias that comes your way. I want to emphasise the positive side of IT communication, and I'm going to come back to that when I speak later. And lastly, of course, the party political power, where the true believers have not only become the unbelievers, they have become the manipulators, they have become the cheats, they have become the liars of our society. I spoke at Ku-ring-gai in the heart of Barry O'Farrell's electorate, and I'll just finish on this story. They invited me to speak there, true blue Liberals, because their homes were under threat from the corruption of the planning and development process in New South Wales, which is really, really serious. Really, really serious. None of your properties are safe if a bribe is paid under the law in New South Wales. And the point of speaking at that meeting was to get the message over that you haven't got a representative. Did Barry O'Farrell raise this on the floor of Parliament? Did he get his members to raise it? But the greatest shock I got was when the planning panel, appointed by the government, agreed to meet a meeting of several hundred people in Ku-ring-gai, and there were 2 cameras present. One of them was a large camera which they saw, the other one was a small camera, and he came to do a film with me a week ago and he showed me the DVD. I'm telling you, it was like pre-war Germany, and that's no exaggeration. What happened there was that the woman who was chairing the meeting on the planning panel spotted the camera, not only ordered the camera out of the room and said there will be no public reporting of this meeting, and of course there's boos and jeers bursting out all over the place, then ordered the security guards to remove the camera, right? Didn't see this other gentleman who got this priceless piece of DVD, which he showed me. And when I saw it, I was absolutely shocked. And I said to him, was Barry O'Farrell, he's a local member as well as a leader of the opposition, was he at the meeting? He said, yeah. I said, what happened? He said, I went up to him and protested. And he said, them's the rules, mate. Now, if that's the stage we've got, where the Leader of the Opposition in his own electorate allows appointed, unrepresented people to dictate to his constituency, never mind New South Wales, and not lift a finger, then I'm seriously worried. The situation in New South Wales is so bad that unless we get a charter of reform which will give us the weapons that we need in order to access power, empower ourselves and empower our community, and we get people who are going to sign up to that, and I go back to the Speaker of the Parliament who was sitting in the audience when I spoke, and now he's the Speaker of the Parliament, and now he's got an 80% majority. 80%. And I said to the people of Kalara, you can change. And one woman comes up to me all very nervous, obviously a rusted-on Liberal. She said, but if we criticise Barry O'Farrell, we're going to give the Labor Party all this ammunition to discredit him. And I said, well, he'll find a way out of that. That's his problem. Don't take his problem on. His problem is he's not representing you and he's not representing the people of New South Wales, and he isn't your representative and he isn't the Leader of the Opposition. It's all a fake, right? And is it coincidence that the two major parties received all these developer donations and the only party that exposed it was the party that didn't receive it, the Greens? You see? So the message I'm giving to you is, and what I said to them, if you think it's impossible, New England, I mentioned this before to the people who were present then, Northern Tablelands, Liberal electorate, now 80% independent. Lake Macquarie, Labor electorate, now independent. Dubbo, solid National Party electorate. If you knew Jerry Peacock as I knew Jerry Peacock from Dubbo, you'd be amazed at how right-wing he was. That's now independent. So we've been through Lake Macquarie, Port Macquarie was a National Party seat, Northern Tablelands Liberal seat, Dubbo National Party seat, all independent seats. Now the message I'm going to get on with is this. If we really are going to change the system, it's not going to be changed from inside the political parties unless you get mass joinings, and at this critical time you're getting mass resignations. It's going to have to come from the outside where ordinary citizens like yourselves have a go and stand 3 or 4 candidates for each of the seats in New South Wales. And you've got a choice. And if they get elected, and they're signed up to, and this is the key to it, they're signed up to freedom of information, citizens-based law, and so on and so on and so on, to give them access to power, then you're going to change the system and the political parties are going to change. So my message is, we've come through this history of struggle in Australia. We've seen some noble achievements along the way by the true believers. Our state, our communities and our nation are being rubbished by the unbelievers, the crooks and the shonks and the spivs. And we can do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you, John and John. So we have an opportunity now for some questions, and I'd like to encourage people at the Access campuses to ask some questions, please. We'll be going with these till about 3:10. So if you could please start to organise your questions of either John Falzon or John Hatton. We'll get on with the Q&A session. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Who is this a question?
I'd just like to say, with reference to what John Hatton was just saying about using IT as a kind of community empowerment tool, a friend of mine has actually created a website in Wollongong. The address is www.reformwcc.info, and I'll try and post that address on one of the boards that this course has access to. But that is actually a forum for Wollongong residents and interested parties to actually discuss the situation that is currently happening in Wollongong with reference to the administration there at the present time. So I just wanted to mention that my question for either of the Johns is, how is it that people, for example, when Bob Carr mysteriously and suddenly resigned, how is it that someone like Yimmer appears in all the media as the obvious replacement, obvious to someone, but certainly not to the public, an unknown man? And how is it that people such as Joe Tripodi and the other fellow that seems to be running New South Wales, how is it that these people, who we know nothing about, who seem to be extremely dodgy, to say the least, how come these people are actually running our state? That's my question.
Before I hand over to John Hatton to answer that question, I can answer briefly. The first part is I don't know. The second part is I do know, but I can't say. So John will now do the history of the transition from premiers to premiers in the Labor Party with reference to branch stacking, the power of the white faction, and the overwhelming power of Joseph Kirby and EDOB. John, would you like to say that?
No, that's... see, I would dearly love to address public meetings in Fairfield and Smithfield and that area in their own electorates. Because they give them the power, we give them the power, simply because we haven't taken it away from them. So how does it work? All right, I'm the member for Kira, or Wollongong, okay? I'm doing a good job, and I've got a particular person in mind, obviously. I'm doing a good job. I'm a member of the ALP. I'm very sincere in what I do. The faction within the branch doesn't like what I do, and for reasons, and I don't know the situation in Wollongong, but we'll say in seat X, have a corrupt agenda. In other words, they want to get non-conforming development applications approved. They want to do favours for party donors. They want to do favours for party mates and so on. Now this applies to both sides of Parliament, let me tell you, in the National Party and in the Liberal Party and in the Labor Party. So how do we get rid of this bloke from Wollongong despite the fact that he's popular and despite the fact that he's doing a good job? And the person I have in mind is still involved with communities, even though he's no longer a Member of Parliament, is you go round and you sign people up into the local branches and you stack the branches and you've got the votes. And so when the pre-selection comes along, ta-da, Mr X, we're replacing you with Mrs Y. And Mrs Y then owes a debt to the people who helped stack the branches. And that's where the power comes from. The Obedes of this world and the Tripodis of this world have the organisational ability, and they have the time, and they have the connections, and they have the support to organise the branches. Now, if you're not successful in organising the branches, they've got sufficient power in party headquarters to actually remove the people's choice and replace them with a head office choice. Now, until that process is changed, these people will continue to have undeserved power. I think it's 5, might be 7 years that Obeid's been in Parliament and he hasn't recorded one word in Hansard. What the hell is he there for? We know what he's there for. We know what he's there for. Now, I could go on about how the upper house is stacked, and we covered that at a previous meeting. So, if I were to suggest, for example, that if the party can't do it, then it's got to be done from outside, because it's the pre-selection process that determines who your Member of Parliament is, not your vote. If you're in a Labor area, as I mentioned last time, you put a label on a dog and it's in a Labor area and the dog gets elected, and if it's a Liberal area, you put a label on the dog and the dog gets elected in the Liberal area. People have got to get out of that habit. Stand their own candidates, people who've got a record of community service and who've signed up to give us back the power we need and to actually be our representatives. But on the other side of things, the Labor Party is going to have to change, because it's going to be swept out of office, but it's going to be replaced by a party who does exactly the same thing. Barry O'Farrell, 2 headlines in the Herald. One day, Farrell pledges to end dollars for development approvals. Next day in the Herald, corporate New South Wales pledges $17 million to the opposition, $3 million more than the Labor Party. End of story.
John, we have a question from Mossvale, from Rosemary. Can you take it?
Yeah, sure.
Which John, Penny? This is...
Oh, John Hatton, sorry then.
Okay.
John Hatton, over to Rosemary.
John, did anyone get up and see at the Redefining meeting and camera coverage was threatened and denied? And how can we convince people that this is their ability to do so?
Did you hear the question?
Now, I do have
the question is...
I do have some hearing loss, so if somebody could repeat the question.
Okay. Yeah.
Just repeat the question,
Did anyone get up and leave at the Coolingline meeting when camera coverage was threatened and denied? And how can we convince people to do that?
Yeah. Did people leave the Coolingline meeting after the camera was removed? Or did they stay at the meeting? And if they didn't, how do you convince people to actually do that when it's not being recorded? That's Rosemary's question.
I wasn't present at the meeting. I only saw the camera record of the meeting, and the camera person said that the meeting became quite uproarious because it was quite obvious that they were sent there to tell the people what they were going to get and how it was going to work, not to listen to what their concerns were. I must also say that I've had discussions with people from Moss Vale, and they're very concerned about the use in Moss Vale of the overriding power of the state government in planning matters. The same problems are occurring in Bomaderry, the same problems are occurring in Wollongong, the same problems are occurring in Ulladulla. So all over New South Wales we have these planning panels and the Minister in Part 3 under the Act just imposing their conditions over and above the council without any regard whatsoever. Now I fear that that's going to get worse, not better. Why? Because they recognise that they're not going to be in power in 12 or 13 months' time, and consequently they're going to do as many favours for their mates as they can in the meantime.
I'm wondering if there's anyone from Bateman's Bay or Shoalhaven who have a question, say, particular for John Falzon. It's not every day we get the CEO of Vinnie's on campus. No rush.
I should ask him, is there any difference between Labor and Liberal in the way they cater for the poor? Coalition and Liberal.
Yes, there are some differences. I guess before Labor, I deal with the federal level, not the state, so I'll restrict my comments to that. At the federal level, to be fair, Labor, upon being elected, made a commitment to a social inclusion strategy which would address some of the causes of disadvantage in Australia. They also committed to and carried through on ameliorating, softening some of the more punitive aspects of breaching, Centrelink breaching. And to be fair, the levels of payment suspension has been significantly reduced. So it would be unfair of me to say there's absolutely no difference. Having said that, I've already referred to a number of what I would consider to be fundamental injustices that continue to be perpetrated by the current government. And I would also have to say, as I'm a member of the government's Social Inclusion Board, with a number of excellent people like Professor Tony Vinson, who is he yet to address? I think in the future you're going to hear from Tony, and he's a terrific guy. And there are some other wonderful people who care deeply about this stuff. But the social inclusion agenda of the federal government is extremely limited. I think it models itself more on the Blair government's approach, which I would characterise as third way, continuing, even if it softens it a little bit, continuing to put the blame on the shoulders of the individual and continuing to claim that the system is right. It's not the system that needs fixing, it's the individual that needs fixing. And so at the very worst, the individual is criminalised, and at the very best, they're pathologised. They're basically, made to feel like there's something wrong with them, but we'll be nice to you. And both approaches are, as far as I'm concerned, not only offensive, but untrue. Do you want me to take questions? Or yes.
I wanted to start with the story. Sorry, I'm going to keep pressing. Sorry about that. I'll start with the story. I had a baby as a single mother during the time of the Fraser regime. Now, people tend to get rosy about the past. At that time, there was a social policy to try and restrict the number, or limit the number of single mothers. So, when I went for help, I got no help. For 2 months, me and my 2 children got hungry. I got sick. In the end, when help came, I was so weak. All I could do was lie on the floor while some charity, whoever it was, brought some boxes of stuff, which you wouldn't be. Well, you can imagine. Now, let's talk about the look at crushed. What happens usually? We don't get crushed. We are angry. We may not say what we think, because if you're in the hands of a charity, you can't. They wouldn't do it. But you have a mind of your own. And you know what you get, and your children will get either. And I want to point out that Fraser was not all sweetness and light. Look what he did to Doc Whitman. Don't forget your history, anybody. Because those who forget their history are like to cop the same bugger, kind of buggery again. What I have noticed though, over time, I noticed a huge change in the ways that this is POL and other similar organisations treated the people who came from them. In the 1980s, single mother spoke. They were sort of cross-examined and then given $4. It was really insulting. I mean, I was cross-examined and interviewed for 2 hours by this fellow working for the Fraser government and then refused what I needed. Just enough money to do it. And now it has changed. I have sole parent friends who talk about the respectful way people from things. And I want to say what a huge difference it makes. This is a personal story, but it's part of that broader struggle to recognise that people who are in need are not at fault because they are in need. Something has happened. Or maybe the system does think. Maybe the system has forced people out of work and they don't have the means to survive. What can we do to make sure that people realise that the system has to change, not the individual?
Thank you. I think the answer to that question is really encompassed in this whole course, and that's why I take my hat off to the organisers. But on another note, I'd like to personally apologise to you for the way that the St Vincent de Paul Society treated you during that time, and I'd like to offer that apology to you on behalf.
I'm just waiting to see if there's someone from Bateman's Bay. Karen, do you have any questions from your class?
Hi, Ben. Here we do have a question for John Falzon.
Okay, go.
The Brotherhood of St Lawrence in Victoria is very outspoken. Can you hear me, John?
Yeah, I'm here.
The Brotherhood of St Lawrence in Victoria is very outspoken.
I can hear you. I can hear you. I'm pleased to see you're very outspoken too. That's good.
It's not the opposition, they're all on the same side. They've also done some interesting research into poverty and the cause of poverty. My question is it true, or is it true that charities fear having their funding withdrawn if they're too outspoken?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I think that's a crucial problem in the way that funding structures have developed in Australia. Again, to be fair to the current government, one of the first acts that Julia Gillard actually announced was the removal of the gagging clauses that were actually put in contracts that forbade certain NGOs from speaking critically, particularly about the government departments who were funding their programs. So thankfully that has gone. However, the reality is, you're absolutely right, that in many cases, particularly where there is competitive tendering for government contracts, where there is a desire to be seen in a positive light by the government, one self-censors. And that's why I believe, for my own money, I will never fall into that practice, because I believe that is a real compromise in an area where one should not compromise. But yes, you're absolutely right. I think charities are subjected to that feeling of pressure not to be outspoken at times. Completely right.
Yeah. I'm wondering, do we have any questions from Shoalhaven?
I've got one. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Given that our economic system relies on economic growth to sustain itself, and as a consequence casts aside those who can't participate and don't have the skills to participate, isn't the gap between rich and poor just going to continually get bigger and bigger? And what do you see as the long-term social consequences of that result?
Is that for me?
John Falzon.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right on the money that it's the gap that matters more than anything else. And I'll give you an example, which John, from what he shared with us, I'm sure knows a great deal more than I do about. During the period of the Depression in Australia, where particularly in a given location, there was a sense that everyone was doing it tough. Now, the toughness was hard. However, where there's a sense of solidarity that we're all in this together, that we're all doing it tough, even though it is hard and even though it is wrong, to be subjected to that kind of impoverishment, it's not the same kind of indignity that is suffered. But where there is a growing gap, that it's like consigning people to the rubbish heap and saying, you don't matter. I'll give you an interesting statistic on this. There's a great book that's been recently written called The Spirit Level, on the rise in social inequality, particularly in wealthy countries. And the statistic is cited that in those countries that are more unequal, not poorer, but more unequal, the level of mental illness is 5 times higher than those countries that have a far more equal society. Just one caveat, though, that I'd place on it. Inequality is not just about income. And it's important that the income component is extremely important in itself, and it's not just a matter of lower incomes staying low, but where the top end become obscenely high, the gap is growing, and that's insulting. But secondly, it's about the inequality of access, the inequality of opportunity, the inequality. To me, as a parent, for instance, I see my 2 children, and if my child comes to us and says they want to learn a musical instrument, we're able to try and make that happen. Not because they're going to become a concert pianist or because they're child prodigy, but because I believe it's a right of a child to be able to explore something like that. Now, to me, it's a crime, it's a social crime to think that there is any child in Australia not able to fulfil or to explore their potential, whether it's in music or sports or academia. So those forms of inequality are crushing, and mark my words, they will cause greater social instability. The more the inequality, the greater the instability in a society. Thanks for your question, it's a great one.
All right, I'm wondering, are there any more questions from Batemans Bay, Shoalhaven, Mossvale, or Vega?
When you're about to say there again, we do have one more question from Mark up in the back corner.
John Falzon.
Yep,
John.
Trip out for my wires again.
John, you mentioned the Northern Territory Intervention and the suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act. How would you deal with those very deeply entrenched issues in the Territory and the Indigenous communities?
How would I deal with... Okay, well, I don't have an answer on how I would deal with it because I certainly don't feel the level of competence. But what I wouldn't do, I can say, I wouldn't go in with a full-scale intervention that was not predicated on the people in the area really genuinely having a say. And I wouldn't impose on the basis of race and location certain laws that the rest of Australia is exempt from. So, for a start, compulsory income management, I certainly would not do. Intervening and saying, we're coming in and we're going to do this, this and that, I would not do. I can honestly say that. But what I would do, I guess by virtue of what I've just said, it precludes me saying what I would do because it's not up to me to decide what to do. But I would start with a genuine community consultation where people were able to identify the issues. The really serious issues that underlie the disadvantage and disempowerment in those communities are infrastructural. So that's another one that's, it's costly, but it's a no-brainer. It's the bleeding obvious once again. Thank you for your question.
And the other bleeding obvious thing is the poverty is because of land theft. The land has been stolen from the Aboriginal people.
Hear, hear.
Okay, are there any other questions from the Access Centre? So I'm concentrating on them particularly because neither of the 2 Johns, I think, are running away anytime soon. So people in this room will have a chance to grab them before Jeffrey Robertson arrives, but people in access centres won't. So if there are no other questions...
Glenn?
Yes, Penny?
Glenn, we have another question in Mossvale for John Falzon.
Far away. John.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just want to know what the name of the book was that you just spoke of.
The name, it was called The Spirit
The
Level.
name of the book, Spirit Level.
Yeah, The Spirit Level. I'm just trying to think
You know,
now.
have you got the author?
Let me just have a...
Right. Okay.
No, it's got...
I should find it out now.
Yeah, if you put The Spirit Level, it'll come to me about 5 minutes after we finish. Sorry. But yeah, it's two authors. Both from England. It'll come. Sorry.
Thank you.
That's all right.
Okay, if there are no other questions...
Yes, I do. I'm from Mega. John Falzon.
Yes.
Inequality. I think education system sets us up for inequality with the religious schools and schools, religion against secular. It's supposed to have a choice, but doesn't that unbalance the level playing field? Because they all want funding, some of them have moral authority, I think. I think that sets up an unlevel playing field.
Right. I'll begin to answer the question, but if I've got the question wrong, please stop me, okay? Did you ask about the inherent inequality between religious schools and the public school system because of the fact that the religious schools are getting public funding in addition to their own funding? Is that the nub of your question?
Sort of, I'm not playing religious schools against secular schools, I'm saying all schools.
Okay.
And it's great to have choice, but they're all going for funding and they're all not going to the same curriculum.
Oh, okay. So you're talking about the distinctly religious curricula of those private schools? Is that the main part of the question? Okay. Oh. I'll answer what I'll give my two bobs worth, but if I haven't answered your question properly, please tell me. I will just say this. I certainly wouldn't promote people not having choices or to do away with people's rights to engage in whatever religious practice or instruction that they wish to. However, as a fundamental of a secular society, and I believe that Australian society, all societies should be fundamentally secular. Make no apologies for that. We should be a secular society, not in any way leaning towards one religious belief or another. And I think you can be pluralistic and respect those religious beliefs whilst maintaining a really healthy secularism. And as part of that, I believe that a strong secular public education should be an absolute plank of that and should not be paying. If there's going to be alternative forms of schooling, fine, as I say, I'm not opposed, but not at the expense of a really strong, robust public education system. Does that answer your question, or have I missed something?
Thank you, Jonathan.
Great, thank you.
All right, we might have time for one more question. If there are no questions from the access centres, I might have one question from here. So are there any other questions from the other campuses? Okay, we'll take one question here, and then...
John Falzon. Yes, have you already answered this question or not? Where is the cost movement in defending the poor and the oppressed at the moment?
Where is the what, sorry?
The cost movement, CISS, the national cost movement.
The causes. Oh, okay. Sorry. Look, no, I've been a member of the ACOS board for some time. I've recently stepped down because of other commitments, and certainly, yes, the COS movement, the councils of social service in each of the states, and the the national body ACOS are certainly right in there. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're a very useful instrument for bringing together all of the different aspects of the community sector. Very good. Thank you. Yeah, all right. Go on. He's out of the room, so yeah.
Reconcile good charitable work. I just think you just push the water. No, I'm going to say push.
This bloke is stuck in the question. I said no.
Can you hear me, John?
Yes, mate.
Thank you. How do you reconcile the good charitable works of St Vincent de Paul with the materialism of Vatican?
Irreconcilable. Irreconcilable, absolutely irreconcilable. No, what's that? Yeah, no, I'm very happy to say it because I really believe it. That again, I'm not trying to impose or presume any particular religious persuasion here, but if you take, to me, the heart of the teachings that I'm interested in are to do with social justice, and I believe that the whole hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church, particularly, is very much rooted in a medieval model of power and politics, and is completely divorced from. I'm not saying there are no good people there, but the whole structure that you've just alluded to is completely irreconcilable as far as I'm concerned. Not only the wealth, but the way that power is played out, the way it is controlled from all levels, whether you're talking about class, gender, race, you name it.